Joining me now is Bloomberg White House correspondent Jeff Mason, co-founder of the Lincoln Project and director of the Latino Working Class Project, Mike Madrid. And here on set with me, the author of Pope Leo, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy, Christopher White, associate director at Georgetown University's Initiative for Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. I don't really even know where to start, but can we put the picture up again? Because you lived in Rome for several years.
Yeah, 4 years.
You've been in hundreds of churches and museums because that's what you do, but you don't have to be in Rome to do that. Is this classic depiction of Christ?
I think anyone that's spent any time in any sort of religious place knows this is a classic image. You don't have to be an art historian to know that. I think it's an insult to the American people to assume otherwise. Millions of Americans are religious, Catholic and non-Catholics alike, and they can tell you exactly what this image looks like.
All right, then there's another fact check. Trump wrote this of Leo, quote, "He was only put there," meaning in the pontiff's seat, "by the church because he was an American, and they thought that would be the best way to deal with President Donald J. Trump." You literally wrote the book on the conclave. You and I were both there when the cardinals were arriving. Was that the topic of conversation?
Well, I think the Cardinals are very clear to say, look, this conclave was not a continuation of the American political election cycle. But I do think the fact that Leo presents himself as a profile of someone who believes in the common good, who is serene and interested in just sort of bringing the world together, offers a pretty stark contrast to the president. And that was pretty attractive to a lot of the Cardinals going into vote. And an American who believes those things and who is committed to multilateralism, sure, that's something they want to see more of, absolutely.
But not someone who would get them in good with Donald Trump.
No, yeah, Pope Leo was not elected to be in the good graces of President Trump, that's for sure.
Jeff, just in the last hour, the president was asked if he would apologize to Pope Leo. Here's his response.
Will you apologize?
No, I don't, because Pope Leo said things that are wrong. He was very much against what I'm doing with regard to Iran, and you cannot have a nuclear Iran. Pope Leo would not be happy with the end result. You have hundreds of millions of people dead, and it's not going to happen. So I can't. I think he's very weak on crime and other things. So I'm not. I mean, he went public. I'm just responding to Pope Leo.
He's responding to things that he never said, Jeff. Let's just be clear on that. He's not looking for a nuclear Iran, nor does he like crime in the streets of our cities. But is there, Jeff, anyone in the White House who thinks that attacking not just a very popular pope, but the first American pope is a good idea?
Oh, I don't know. It's hard to say if there's anyone in the White House who thinks that's a good idea, but I think that probably applies to a lot of some of the president's social media presence. I think the fact-checking that you've done so far is spot on. Certainly the president's words there in his social media post and in the gaggle with reporters that he just did is classic Donald Trump, in that he lashes out at people who oppose him or oppose his policies. And that applies to anyone from, a lower-level political analyst to the Pope of the Catholic Church. It's also a contrast with how he welcomed the election of Pope Leo when he was elevated to this position. President Trump was thrilled and connected the fact that he was an American, as he did in that social media post that you referenced today, to basically being a compliment to him. Then he changes his tune when someone like the Pope opposes him or is critical of his policies. So it's in line with how he treats people, friend or foe, when they are on different sides of things. And they are very definitely on different sides of whether war is a good thing.
Mike, do you have a sense of how all of this is landing with the Latino community, whether it's criticizing the Pope or posting himself in an iconic setting of Jesus? We should say many in the Latino community are Catholic. Many of them helped President Trump take back the White House in 2024. What are you hearing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, look, the answer is it's not landing well. You've got a president who's slipping in the polls broadly with all sorts of constituencies. The Catholic vote itself broke decidedly for Donald Trump in 2024. And the Catholic vote has always been sort of a bellwether of where the country seems to be going. It's one of those few swinging votes that remains in American politics. But the Latino vote itself is actually a bigger swing vote, and it's comprised about half of which are Catholics. And Catholicism politically is very different than white evangelical Protestantism. It's not motivated nearly the same way that culturally conservative, socially conservative issues are. It tends to be much more social justice messaging that comes from, being deeply imbued with Catholic traditional teachings. So the reverence for the poor, the least among us, the immigrant, the refugee, the stranger, all of that language that you're hearing from Pope Francis and now from Pope Leo is really a uniting force for Catholics, especially when the Latino community is under siege and very much views itself being hunted and terrorized by this administration. So again, Pope Leo, by the way, is one of the few very, very popular public figures in America today. So this is going to be, I think, very damaging for the president, politically. But beyond that, I think this could be just a generational moment where people kind of waking up and realizing this man is not at all who we thought he was.
It's interesting, Chris. We were looking at those live pictures from Algeria. The Pope is on the first of, I think, an 11-day trip to Africa, where the church has been growing, unlike here in the United States, although the number of converts has been going up, particularly among a lot of young people who seem to be searching, just as Mike pointed out, in an uncertain world, looking for maybe a little bit of stability. But let's talk about Bishop Robert Barron, member of the president's Religious Liberty Commission. He slammed Trump for his statements, calling them entirely inappropriate and disrespectful. We also heard on 60 Minutes, this was before Trump made these comments in Truth Social, a group of American cardinals talking about the Pope's criticism of the war. Here it is.
He's the pastor of the world. He's not a pundit. So the distinction is he's not going to pronounce on everything, but he's going to pronounce on what's important.
How are things landing here in churches? I've been listening very closely at Mass to hear whether or not it would come from at least the pulpit. I don't think New York City is necessarily a harbinger of, what else might be happening. But has he changed the way some priests and some religious and maybe even folks in other faiths may approach this?
As Mike said earlier in the segment, Pope Leo enjoys remarkable approval ratings. He's one of the most trusted leaders on the world stage right now. And what's remarkable to me is that we've heard President Trump time and time again clamor for the Nobel Peace Prize, right? He likes to boast about all these wars that he's allegedly ended. He would have no greater partner on the world stage than Pope Leo, who has continually made peace his top priority, if he really wanted partnership. But I think we've seen over the last 24 hours that's not what's motivating President Trump.
Mike, the reaction to the AI depiction of Trump as Christ has been brutal. A lot of Trump-friendly conservative influences are nothing short of furious. They've called it outrageous. They've called it sacrilegious. They called for Trump to take it down, which he did. In 2024, you pointed this out, 55% of the Catholic vote went for Donald Trump. I just wonder, as he continues down this, what seems to be a path of a fight with Pope Leo, is it your sense that there is anyone in the community who might have any influence? I'm not sure what influenced him to take down that post, but do you take it as a direct response?
Well, there's no question. Look, this was an appropriate capitulation. I think when he started to get pushback from white evangelicals within the White House, who were look, there's a growing anti-Catholic sentiment that is tangible from this White House, and it's been emanating for the entirety of the second term, and now it's seeping out into direct attacks on the Pope. This sort of blasphemous, by anybody's estimation, a blasphemous image that even evangelicals were recoiling from. So look, this is a president who's decided to take on an extraordinarily popular, well-revered, well-liked figure. Leo himself, by the way, leaned into violence and the anti-Fujimori sentiment in Peru, left Chicago to be there amongst the faithful during a time of great violence. He's not afraid of these issues. He has a deep commitment, as he should, as the Pope, to the gospel and preaching to those that need to hear this word. I think that's emanating beyond the Catholic faithful. It's moving up to Christianity and to people of all faiths who are saying, wait a second, why are we engaged in this war? Why are we doing this? And for the moment, I think the public globally is responding to Leo's message, which is coming almost daily now. And that, I think, is what the president has been recoiling from.
Whether it's this or the war, Jeff Mason, or immigration, as Mike rightly points out, sometimes it seems like that whole thing was like last year, but of course it was only a few months. Are you hearing anything within the White House that there is some sort of trickle-down concern about what this might mean for the midterms? Or is there continuing bluster that somehow all of this is going to work out, gas prices are going to come down, and people are going to come back around?
Oh, I think there's definitely concern about the midterms for many of the reasons that you just cited, Chris. Certainly the concern about gasoline prices goes all the way to the top, and that's something that may last all the way through the midterms, which is something that the president referenced over the weekend, too. But this type of thing doesn't help. That said, I would add a fact check of my own to this segment, which is it takes a lot for the religious right to part with Donald Trump. And what would be interesting to me to see is if someone like Franklin Graham says that post was inappropriate. Anyone who spent any time in Sunday school growing up, as I certainly did, knows that that is a religious-looking picture. But that doesn't mean that they are parting with him unless it goes up to really the top supporters of the evangelical right community. Seeing some comments on Twitter does not a break make.